you all for coming, and thanks to Professors Loreline and Meyer and to Dean Haythorne for inviting me. It's my pleasure to be here. So I want to position this talk a little bit as a history of the child as a reader. If you know anything about the history of readers in general or the history of children's readership in general, you'll know that it's very difficult to come to any understanding of what people do as readers, what they enjoy, what they have read, how they respond to it, and particularly with children who are often in very different circumstances than adult readers. They often have people who are purchasing the reading materials for them, who are prescribing their reading in many ways, and children often do not keep records of what they read. Consequently, it's been very difficult for people like me to come up with much understanding of what it means to be a young person as a reader. There have certainly been people who have tried in various capacities. There's a recent Cambridge history from M.A. Ganti that looks at 18th century English children's reading using diaries as records. My colleague Kate McDowell has used librarian surveys from the early 20th century to look at children's interest in reading. Alison Waller in England at Roehampton has also looked at adults' memories of their reading as young people. And there are a few other folks who have done little bits. But the history of children's reading gets even more complicated when you get into a contested area like comics, which were largely derided by adults and teachers and librarians and other folks like that as both ephemeral and consumer-oriented. There are still a few folks who have attempted to delve into what it means to be a comics reader, like Matthew Putz, who's looked at adults' ideas about reading comics. And Mel Gibson in England also has looked at, again, adult memories of childhood comics reading. But what I want to do today is to situate the child as a comics reader, in particular looking at some evidence, some conversations that children began with the critics of comics, but also show you a little bit more about a larger project I'm engaged in. But first, I want to give you just a really quick overview of the difference between comics then and now. In the United States, beginning in the late 1830s, how about the late 1930s, comics were the dominant cultural artifact of childhood. By the very early 1940s, more than 95% of all elementary school-aged young people and more than 85% of high school-aged young people in the United States were regular comics readers. And that didn't just mean that they read a comic book or a comic strip every once in a while. That meant that for some of these kids, they were reading perhaps 50 comic books a week or following 20 to 30 comic strips regularly. So they were reading lots and lots of comic books. So that by 1940, 2 years after Superman came on the scene, comic books in terms of sheer dollars were outselling children's books in the United States by a figure of 5 to 1. $10 million worth of comic books, $2 million worth of children's books. By the early 1950s, when the sales of comics peaked, and I need to be clear that comics are not solely a child's medium. There were adults who were reading comic books as well, but children were by far the largest purchasers. And so by 1953, when the sale of comics peaked in the United States, there were 1 billion new comics sold each year. That's more than 100 million a month, or almost 100 million a month. And that's just the new titles. So kids also resold their comics. Drugstores and newsstands repackaged older comics for resale. And the average pass-through rate that was estimated at that point in time was between 5 and 8 people. So for every new comic that was sold, between 5 and 8 people read it. Now, at this point in time, in 1953, there were about 33 million school-aged young people living in the United States. So if you do the math, that's more than 30 comic books sold, new comics sold for every young person living in the U.S. Now, compared to today, today comics are experiencing a renaissance. in readership, in sales, in publication in the U.S. And when I talk about comics, I'm talking about trade paperbacks and graphic novels and all of that together, not just comic books. But if we look at comic sales in the United States today, 2012, we sold about 80 million comics. That's fewer comics in 1 month, or fewer comics in 1 year than were sold in 1 month in 1953. So if we do this proportionally, for the school-aged children who are alive in the U.S. today, that's about 1.5 comics per year that are sold. So there's been a big shift in terms of readership. So what am I going to talk about today? Professor Loreline gave you a little bit of a taste in terms of talking about Wertham and talking about the United States Senate hearings on juvenile delinquency in the 1950s. And what I want to do is share with you some correspondence between young readers and Frederick Wertham, the psychiatrist, and also the senators who were investigating juvenile delinquency and its link with comics. But to do that, I want to start with what I consider a touchstone. And this is a letter to the editor that was published in 1948 in July by a young man, David Pace Wagransky. It was published in the Saturday Review of Literature, publication which isn't around anymore, but it was the cultural publication of its time, even more so than we might think of the New Yorker today, which is about its closest equivalent. David Wagransky, his letter ran to more than a page. And Norman Cousins, who was the editor of the Saturday Review of Literature, said that the only editing he did to this letter was for length. So I have no idea how long the original letter was, but it was a number of columns as it was printed. And David Wagransky systematically dismantled the arguments that he had read 2 months previously in an article by Frederick Wertham that was also published in the Saturday Review of Literature, that sought to outline the basic tenets that he would go on to espouse for the next 6 or 7 years about why comics were bad for young readers. Wagransky claimed as his expertise the fact that he owned more than 5,000 comics. He was a sophomore at age 14, so he was intellectually prodigious. He went on, he died in his 30s in a car accident, I believe, but he went on to become the bibliographer for the jazz musician Al Jolson, along with an expert in vintage comics. So he wasn't a dumb person. And in this letter to the editor, he outlined both a history of comics art in America, as well as a state of what was going on currently, and also touched on some forensic cases that would have been of interest to Frederick Wertham, who was a forensic psychiatrist. So he was able to draw on things such as the Leopold and Loeb murders, which had captivated Chicago several years previously, and even going back to Cain and Abel in the Old Testament, and thinking about that impact on violence. Wagransky's letter in many respects was a call to arms both for young readers and for comics producers to fight back against what he felt was a protectionist stance based on misconstrued, erroneous evidence about comics reading. Now Wertham, this man he was writing to, as I mentioned, was a forensic psychiatrist. He was well trained. He was German-born. He trained both in Germany and England, and then he came to the U.S. to study with Adolf Meyer at the Phipps Clinic at Johns Hopkins University. Adolf Meyer is often referred to as the grandfather or father of American psychiatry, so it was a very prestigious appointment. Wertham went on to direct the mental hygiene clinics at Bellevue Hospital and other hospitals in New York. So in many respects, he was quite well regarded. In the mid-1940s, Wertham began the first low-cost mental hygiene and social work clinic in Harlem at a time when it was still quite segregated in the U.S., racially segregated. And for a quarter, folks of all ages could come and seek mental health treatment. They could have folks from the Lafargue Clinic come to give testimony at juvenile delinquency trials or other kinds of court hearings. And in his work with young people at the Lafargue Clinic and at the other medical institutions he was affiliated with, he began to see what he found to be a correlation between juvenile delinquency, which at that time was defined broadly. You were a juvenile delinquent if you skipped school. You were a juvenile delinquent if you beat someone up. You were a juvenile delinquent if you daydreamed too much in your classes. So he found what he believed was a relationship between juvenile delinquency and comic book reading. Now, it's kind of funny to think about that today. It was funny to some extent at the time, because if you recall just 2 slides ago, I said that 95% of all elementary kids read comics and 85% of all teenagers did. So to find a relationship between juvenile delinquency and comic book reading didn't take much of a stretch of one's imagination. But he was convinced that there was much at stake, and so in 1948, his work was highlighted in Collier's magazine. This is a lovely illustration of a child being pretend stabbed with a fountain pen. This is supposedly directly a result of reading comics. Also in 1948, after the Saturday Review of Literature piece that he wrote was published, it was condensed in Reader's Digest. And his work was highlighted in publications like Ladies' Home Journal, as well as psychiatric publications. He was a frequent guest on radio programs. He spoke around New England and the Atlantic seaboard. And all of this culminated with the 1954 publication of Seduction of the Innocent, which was a book-length version of all of the things he had talked about in the Saturday Review of Literature so many years previously. Seduction of the Innocent was also condensed in Reader's Digest. And it's this condensed version that young people started responding to. So you've already heard a little bit from Brian McLaughlin, aged 11, in the introduction that Professor Loreline gave. He wrote, the letter is dated April 1953, but it was really April 1954. I think Wertham probably took that as evidence of more of the errors of comics. But he wrote to Wertham this letter in which he articulated the idea that there was a problem with Wertham's notion that comic reading led to juvenile delinquency. It was simple, it was straightforward. He told Wertham that he read a dozen comics a day, and he seemed like a normal kid. And he also made a little bit of an appeal, as you can see towards the end, although not well elaborated, of what he saw as the gulf between adult and child. I sincerely wish that you could understand comic books as I do. A lot of the young people who wrote to Wertham, who wrote to the Senate that year, expressed similar sentiments. They realized that adults didn't perceive comics in the same way that they did, that there was truly a difference in understanding. Another young man wrote to the Senate, Howard Kahn. He says, "I've written this letter that you yourself can understand us kids that read comics." So again, this idea that there was a difference in approach and sentiment and response. Lynn Crawford, who was an 8th grader in Atlanta, wrote a 3-page letter to Wertham in which she tried to deconstruct his argument and come up with a parallel one. So do you suggest that we give up comic books and turn to cigarettes, adult crime, and sex books and liquor? And I find this argument interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, Wertham was a smoker, so I don't know what he would have thought of that particular suggestion. But he had also been a witness for the defense in a sex book hearing. There was a publisher in New York of a nudist magazine who was being prosecuted for obscenity, and he actually testified in defense of this publisher. So at that point in time, nudist magazines were about as close as you got to naughty publications. So her suggestion that maybe we need to turn to crime and sex books, I think is particularly of interest. She also mentions in this letter that her opinion probably doesn't mean anything because she's just a kid. And again, that is both referencing that gulf of understanding as well as, I think, her concern that she wouldn't be perceived as having any sort of authority or power. And you see that as well in other children's letters. And I know it's difficult to see, but at several points you might be able to pick up a red pen in the margins or under particular words. And Wertham was very fond of redlining young writers' errors. So if they misspelled a word, if they used incorrect grammar or non-standard grammar, he would circle it, make a little note. And in fact, in his handwriting at the top, he's written in pencil, children's letter, reading, comma, spelling. So this was further evidence for him of the detrimental effects of comics. Because it wasn't just that kids were going to turn into evil individuals, they were going to lose the ability to spell and to form coherent sentences. And in almost no instances did he respond to the young people who wrote in with letters like this that were in disagreement with him, and he was especially not interested in responding to letters where there were so many misspellings. He didn't do this with letters from adults, which I also think is quite telling. The day after Wertham testified to the U.S. Senate committee, subcommittee, these three high school seniors from Wilson, Oklahoma, sat down and wrote a letter together. They were fans of Classics Illustrated along with a number of other comic books. But they articulated an argument that a number of young writers did, the idea that what was on television, what was in film, on the radio, in books that adults read themselves, and even in folk tales that adults recommended that young people read, that a lot of those materials had content that was objectionable and just as bad as some of what was in the comic books. And yet adults weren't taking action in any particular respect on that account. There were other letters from readers of Classics Illustrated. So Classics Illustrated, you all familiar with it, great books, you know, Moby Dick, Tale of Two Cities, in comic book format. A lot of adults and many kids figured that Classics Illustrated was primarily to do book reports in school from. And Wertham didn't like Classics Illustrated either, because he found that as much of a crime comic book as all of the rest, because he had a very broad definition of what crime comics were. It wasn't just the comics with titles like Crime Does Not Pay or Police Tales. That didn't matter. Crime comics included Superman, because there were criminals in Superman. Crime comics included Donald Duck, because Donald Duck hit other characters, and that made it a crime comic. Crime comics included anything where there was the intimation of violence, of criminal behavior. And Classics Illustrated included some elements of that. I mean, imagine A Tale of Two Cities. There's violence in that book. There's bloodshed in that book, and therefore that book was also suspect for Wertham. Now, I mentioned that the three young men from Oklahoma wrote that letter the day after Wertham testified. The Senate had actually investigated comic books as early as 1950 as part of hearings on organized crime and interstate commerce. But in 1954, as many people in the greater public began to be concerned about what they felt was the ill influence of comics reading, the Senate felt compelled to act. So they organized a series of hearings on comic books and children's television and radio. The comic book hearings were held over 3 days in New York City, 2 in April and 1 in June. And they had a roster of folks testifying in front of the senators. You can see in the top left, this is Frederick Wertham testifying here. These hearings were televised, and they were taking place at the same time as some of the McCarthy Army hearings in the U.S. So it wasn't that they were front page news, but they were certainly part of the bigger social and cultural news of the time. So it was covered widely in the newspapers and magazines of the day. You can see here Senator Robert Hendrickson of New Jersey, who is largely responsible for initiating the hearings. You can see some of the comics that they were most concerned about. And granted, there were plenty of comics out there. There were more than 600 titles available on newsstands at that point in time. And there were certainly comics that were probably not the best reading for young people. Because after World War II, comics publishers in the U.S. had broadened their offerings to accommodate the interests of adults coming back from World War II. And so there were many more mature themes, romance comics, horror comics, science fiction comics that didn't necessarily intend children as readers, but found plenty of kids willing to read them anyway. One of the folks who testified at the Senate hearings, in fact, he testified immediately following Frederick Wertham, was Bill Gaines. And Bill Gaines was the publisher of EC Comics. EC Comics started out as educational comics. It became entertaining comics. And what we most remember EC Comics for today, outside of the comic book world, is Mad Magazine, which is still in publication. This is who we have to thank for Mad Magazine. EC Comics was incredibly popular as a publisher in the late 1940s and early 1950s. It was the publisher, for instance, of The Haunt of Fear and crime suspense stories, and a whole host of other sort of macabre and gory comic books that pushed boundaries. It was also a particularly literate and well-drawn series of comic books that attracted an avid following of teenage and young adult readers. Gaines was verbally crucified in many respects on the witness stand in front of the Senate. And after the hearings, he issued this editorial appeal for action in the pages of his comic books. And it's actually really interesting to read in whole because even though Wertham was perhaps one of the people who despised Gaines the most, Gaines never mentions Wertham in this appeal. What he does ask is that his readers, whatever their opinion is, whether they think comics are good for kids or comics are bad for kids, that they write to the Senate. That the Senate needed to hear the opinions of real readers. And so it didn't matter to Gaines whether they liked his comics or not. He just wanted them to hear from real people. And that if young readers perhaps were too young, that maybe they could get their parents to write in as well. And again, it didn't really matter what their opinions were. He also asked that you keep the letters polite, which I thought was kind of interesting. And not everyone did that. The Senate got more than 200 letters, which seemed to be inspired by the EC editorial. And there was one that I read from a 15-year-old kid named Barry Charon, who at one point referred to the senators as, quote, stupid, ignorant, old-fashioned, prude-minded people. So not everyone was as polite as Gaines might have liked. And I just wanted to point out that the EC Comics were also the first comics to inspire a reader-driven fan club. So Gaines picked up on it, and you can see the certificate you got if you sent in a quarter. You got a certificate, you got a badge, and you got a subscription to the EC Fan Addict Bulletin, which ran for 5 issues. And a lot of young people sent their names in and listed them as EC fan addicts so they could exchange comics with folks from across the country. So one of the folks who wrote in to the Senate, prompted by what Gaines had to say, was Phil Proctor. And Phil Proctor was 14, and he went to an elite boarding school, the day school in New York City. He had grown up with comics. He spent his summers in Goshen, Indiana, in the northern part of the state, at his grandparents', and he spent time playing with comics. He would ride to the variety store with his friends, and they would buy things and go back to their clubhouse. One of his friends really did break his arm from trying to be like Superman and flinging himself off the garage roof. But Phil Proctor was very inspired by EC, and he wrote a lovely defense saying that we're not buying these because we want to be criminals. We're buying these because these are comics that really inspire us as readers. And Phil Proctor, in many respects, was so inspired by both EC and by the Senate hearings that it molded who he became as an adult. He is a co-founder of the Firesign Theater, which is America's Monty Python. And when I spoke to him, he said that in large measure it was the Senate hearings that really prompted him to become a satirist, because he, quote, wanted to stick it to the blue-nosed, tight-assed censors. So even 60 years later, he's still a little pissed off. Brian Mulholland wrote in as well. And his letter, I think, exemplifies another type of letter that came into the Senate, in that kids wanted to represent themselves as upstanding, as good kids, not the kinds of juvenile delinquents that comic book readers were portrayed to be. His letter also talks about freedom of expression, talks about the importance of the First Amendment, and talks about how he believes that the U.S. government will act responsibly and not ban or restrict the sale of comics. Brian Mulholland retired recently as a district attorney in New Jersey, and when I talked to him, I sent him a copy of his letter, and he said that he couldn't have written a better one now. So he still believes what he wrote at age 15. Moreover, he told me, as we were ending the interview, I'd already turned off the recorder, he started telling me about a story that he remembered reading at age 13 from one of the comics. And he describes it to me. He says, you know, I just was telling one of my sons about this story. And he describes the story. He doesn't remember the name. And he tells me panel by panel what happens. He's not looked at it since he was 13. And it was so vivid that I immediately knew what story it was. But I Googled to check. And it was this story, Judgment Day, which is about racism in space. But it had that profound of an effect on him that many decades after. A few young people, like Harley Elliott, were equally explicit about the idea of freedom of expression, about the idea that government regulation would be a detriment. Harley Elliott was a big fan of Two-Fisted Tales, one of EC's comics that dealt with the Korean War. And the Korean War was very much a part of his everyday life at that time. It was in the news, and this allowed him to participate in the war to some degree, because the stories were quite realistic. Some EC readers have told me that when you look at the EC war comics, it's very clear what kinds of weapons the soldiers are holding on to. They're drawn that realistically. Soldiers were reading these. Harley Elliott said that he, too, has been inspired by these comics throughout his life. He doesn't have his childhood collection, but he's repurchased many of these in reprint form. He has grown up, he still lives in Salina, Kansas, and he's published a number of books of poetry. He's also a visual artist, and he said that his visual art is very much inspired by what he read in EC as a teenager. He also said, interestingly, that when he looked at his letter again after all of these years, that his sentiments were quite naive. He was surprised that he probably wouldn't have sent it as an adult, in part because he realizes that it wouldn't have made an impact. For the people that I've contacted who were these letter writers, particularly the folks who wrote to the Senate, they have told me that with the exception perhaps of a postcard that they received on the receipt of their letter, that they never had any contact. I was the first person after 60 years to talk to them, to notice that their letters had been read. So what was the outcome? So we have Wertham's book, his diatribe, which was a notable book of the year, sold 16,000 copies in the US and more in Canada and Great Britain. We had the Senate hearings that captivated a number of folks throughout the country. The result was that the Senate didn't do anything. They didn't decide to regulate comics, but the comics publishers themselves did. And in September of that year, they banded together and formed the Comics Magazine Association of America. And they hired a gentleman, I'll go back. They hired this gentleman, a juvenile court judge named Charles Murphy, to be the comic czar. They actually called him the comic czar. And they implemented the Comics Code, which was a quite restrictive code that essentially required comics publishers to submit their stories and art in advance of publication to be looked over by a board of editors. And I told someone the other day, this sounds silly, but they really were a room filled with little old women. Many of them were retired teachers and retired librarians. There were, I think, a dozen of them who worked, and they previewed all of this art, and they would make explicit changes in pencil. And if you didn't change things the way they requested, you did not get the Comics Code seal of approval, and you weren't going to get your comics sold on newsstands. Some of the things that were forbidden, you couldn't have vampires or werewolves. You couldn't have images depicting people with disabilities. You couldn't have stories in which kids talked back to their parents or in which anyone talked back to police officers. You couldn't have comics that had the words crime or horror in large letters on the cover. And you had to minimize your use of slang and bad grammar because that was also not a good thing. As a consequence, a large number of publishers went out of business rather than try to comply with the code. And quite frankly, a lot of kids quit reading comics after the code came into effect because comics weren't a whole lot of fun anymore. Over time, the age of readers crept up so that in the United States right now, the average comic reader really is someone in his late 20s. I said his because the average comic reader in the US is also male, and someone with a reasonable amount of disposable income. And it's not just the code that did that. There was a whole constellation of things that happened. But comics are certainly much less of a kid's medium these days. The Comics Code itself, although it went through several revisions, was only finally dismantled once and for all in February of 2011. So only 2 years ago. Archie Comics was the last comic publisher to still submit things to the code. So I want to end this portion with a postscript. Shortly after the Senate hearings concluded, Robert Warshaw, who was an associate editor for Commentary magazine, wrote a story that was published in Commentary called Paul, the Horror Comics, and Dr. Wertham. And his son, Paul, was 11 years old and an avid comic book reader. And Warshaw's article is one of the best written case studies you could possibly imagine of what comics mean to a young reader. And Robert Warshaw, as his parent, wrestles with how all of this fits together and what to make of what Wertham has to say and what to make of the controversy in general and how to reconcile that with his son's experience. Wertham read this article in Commentary, and he wrote to Paul, the son. And he wanted to know, for instance, what Paul thought of his father's article. And Robert Warshaw wrote back first, the father did, and said, actually I found myself agreeing with you in more ways than I thought possible. And the week later, Paul writes back. And I love this. He's still saying, most children learn enough to know if a comic is sensible. Only a few would take an unlikely story seriously. So again, this idea that Wertham might have been stretching a little bit too far. He says at the PS, I would very much like to meet you. And I don't know that they ever met. I didn't find any evidence of that. But I did find evidence that, for whatever reason, Wertham sent Paul an autographed headshot. I don't know. I don't know why Wertham had headshots or why he was sending them to an 11-year-old boy. But that's another story. What I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about, and then I want to open things up for questions and discussion, is sort of how this fits with the larger project that I'm pursuing right now. My real interest is trying to reclaim the voices of these children who read comics. 33 million young people in 1953, more than 80%, 85% of them reading comics. That's an awful lot of kids who were alive once upon a time reading comics as part of their childhood. And we have very little in the way of synthesized record. There were a number of studies done at the time that looked at child readership. There were scores of newspaper articles. There were anecdotal accounts. There was much, but a little bit in the way of honoring or recognizing or trying to pull all of this together. And so I want to outline some of the types of evidence, some of the sources of children's voices that we can draw on today to come to a better understanding of how comics fit in their lives. So, especially in New York City, but elsewhere too, there were a number of student forums that were held that were televised or broadcast on radio that were reported as well in the newspapers. And this is one, the headline for this is "Some Comics Good, Pupil Panel Finds." And so we have quotes like this from some of the participants, so we can get a sense of what young people were thinking. We usually have a sense of, if not their names, of how old they were or what grades they were in, where they were coming from. I spoke with Joe McGinty, and he said that he doesn't remember anything about the forum except that he threw up in the car on the way there. He was so nervous. We have a host of journal articles from big journals and small journals, forgotten journals, and some of these have attributed statements. So this is from a letter from Alice Mays. You can see her picture there in the corner. And she's talking primarily about comic strips rather than comic books, but again, this idea that relaxation is good. And over again in what kids have to say, you'll find this sentiment. One young person that I often quote says, kids should be allowed to relax the same as adults. So comic books were their source of relaxation and enjoyment. In the Frederick Wertham manuscript collection, which was just open to researchers widely in the summer of 2010, I was astounded to find case study after case study after case study after case study. He was a practicing psychiatrist. And the organization of the collection is such that you can go box by box and chapter by chapter and see exactly what he used to write Seduction of the Innocent. And you see the transcripts of therapeutic sessions with individuals and with groups of young people, where they spend a lot of time talking about the specific comics they read, what they think of them, how they inspire them, how they play with comics. Many of these are incredibly painful to read because a lot of these kids were abused sexually or physically. Many of them were mentally handicapped in some ways. A lot of them were incredibly impoverished and Everything is there to look at. But there's also quite a bit about the comics that were popular, and again, how they fit in their lives, where they read them, how they read them, who they read them with. A number of studies have big chunks of data, some of it digested, others not. So there were both journal articles that reported survey data, as well as a fair number of primarily master's level theses conducted in the US during the 1940s and early 1950s that look at comics readership and preferences at both the elementary age and high school age. And so you get some ideas here about comics popularity, about readership figures, that sort of thing. A number of folks who were comics readers during these years are also now writing memoirs. Many of them are self-published, which means they're pretty easily searched on Google Books. And Norm Benedict, for instance, actually talks about comics quite a bit in his book, several pages worth. I've also interviewed him. And this, it's clear for some of these folks that comics were a big part of their lives. There are memoirs where these once young readers talk about the clubhouses that they constructed and where they stored their comics, how they sat on the floor in the drugstore and read them and were sometimes chased off. There's a great story about how, in one memoir I read, about how a young man agrees to give up his claim on a little girl's affections in exchange for a stack of comic books. So there are just these lovely stories about how comics fit in young people's lives. And as I mentioned, I've also been doing interviews. So for instance, in the large photo here, this is Abe Hoffman. Abe was 16 and in high school in Los Angeles in the fall of 1954 when the city of Los Angeles thought about trying to restrict the sale of comics as a local municipality. And he did something which a lot of 16-year-olds wouldn't do. He went to the city council meeting and he stood up and he said, don't. He told them that he had a garage filled with comic books at home, and really the folk tales, the Grimm's fairy tales, were much more dangerous and damaging than any of the comics he had read. This is Opal Noble. Opal Noble was 13 and in the 8th grade when she was class secretary, and her class as a whole had a series of discussions at the prompting of her 8th grade teacher. They talked about comics, in particular about Green Arrow and whether Green Arrow was respectable as a character, and she struck up a correspondence with Frederick Wertham and exchanged several letters with him, and he even sent them a large box of chocolates from Macy's. And she told me that she remembers the chocolates more than anything else because a number of her classmates were so poor that they had never seen chocolates packaged like that before. And there was enough that each of them got one. And she said that some of her classmates made their one chocolate last all day. And then finally, this is Bob Stewart. I don't have a picture of him as a teenager. Bob Stewart is someone I've spoken with quite a number of times. Not only did he make a career in the comics business as an adult, but he founded 2 of the first 3 comics fanzines as a 15 and 16-year-old in the early 1950s. And he also corresponded with Frederick Wertham. As a librarian, I also particularly appreciate the fact that his public library in the little town where he grew up in Texas did not have a copy of Seduction of the Innocent, but he went to the public librarian and demanded that she order it, and she did. So he was 16 when he did that, and he read it and promptly wrote to Wertham. So that is what I'd like to share with you today, and I'd love to open this up for questions and comments and see what you would like to know or talk about. So thank you. Yes, sir.
What were the adult responses to the choice to draw a correlation between adult and teen children?
There were non-responses. That was primarily what happened. The Senate, as I mentioned, at most just simply acknowledged the correspondence with a postcard, and Wertham seldom responded to anyone in writing.
Did you interview Ollie?
No, I have not. I'm broadening the scope of my study. So the folks that I've interviewed so far for our institutional review board approval, I said that I would only talk to people who had self-identified through contests or fan clubs or other kinds of things like that as comics readers as kids, but I will be expanding.
Just for Canadian
Yes.
context, I know the Canadian Parliament
Yes.
of the time discussed comics. And it was generally throughout North America that fear not just of what was juvenile delinquency, but what was heteronormativity and how it would be influenced by so many different media and forms. But I always, as well as understanding this, my understanding, which is only from memory, is that the greatest area of reaction was the crime comic. So the crime comic was adult. It was, for most people here have never seen them.
Yes.
They were sexist, they were sexualized, they were horrific. They would be considered pornography now.
Yes.
And they were sold to kids, although they were created for adults, really, adult males, really. And they were like the tip of the iceberg, because that's where most people, if they objected to comics in general and child readership, were thinking of the crime comics. They weren't thinking of Donald Duck. They weren't thinking of Superman. Librarian archives are just fascinating because there's discussion of this period of what to do about the comics, what do you think about the comics, where should we take a stand. And then the crime comics are so different from the rest of the comics under discussion.
Yes.
That's what governments seem to be. That's what Canadian government was reacting to.
Canada did attempt to regulate crime comics, and Wertham very much admired what the Canadian Parliament was doing. There were crime comics which teenage boys referred to as headlight comics because they were the ones that portrayed women, all of their bustiness and curviness. But if you look in the U.S. at parental objections to comics, you'll find that a lot of the westerns were included, a lot of the romance comics were included. So there was one group in Cincinnati, for instance, that regularly evaluated comics, and their reviews and evaluations were published in Parents Magazine. And they were as inclusive as Wertham was in defining crime comics. Some of the superhero comics were okay, but others weren't. Most of the Western comics were questionable. A lot of the war comics and that kind of thing were questionable too.
I started collecting comics in the late 50s, early 60s, and did obviously became a librarian. I started reading about people reading comics, and I was frankly somewhat confused by the big discussion of Batman and Robin and their supposed weird relationship. And since it was only years later, I finally figured out what everybody was talking about. Talking about, but did you come up against that? I mean, to me, and what I remember reading, that seemed to be one of the big issues that brought in the comics code, was this idea of an adult man and a young teenage boy, and what's really going on when they're not out there.
Wertham was very concerned about that, and he does suggest that Batman and Robin are homosexual. In Seduction of the Innocent. He also questions, for instance, Wonder Woman's relationship with Wonder Girl, in part because there is an image in one comic book, a panel in one comic book, where they're sitting across the table having breakfast with one another. Now, it doesn't mean, it didn't matter to Wertham that Wonder Woman had brought Wonder Girl home because her parents supposedly had died in a plane crash or boat. I don't remember how her parents supposedly perished. But just because they were sitting across the table having a discussion about what constitutes a nutritious breakfast that had lesbian overtones for Wertham. That was an unhealthy relationship. And if you look in the files, there is quite a bit. He does interview young men who self-identified as homosexual. And he distorts some of their evidence, some of their testimony. Some of them don't really care about Batman and Robin. One kid says, you know, I was really more attracted to Tarzan. But it's Batman and Robin that Wertham chooses to play up. Yes.
Perhaps related to these questions about heteronormativity, I was wondering, I noticed that most of the examples you gave were boys.
Yes. Yes.
And I was just curious as to if you could speak a little more about the gender dynamics.
Sure. So there were girls writing as well. There were more boys who did write, but there were a fair number of girls. Maybe 30% of the letters I've looked at are from girls. And part of my problem in doing follow-up is that it's very difficult to find women after 60 years. I found and talked to a few. But girls certainly were reading comics at that point in time. There wasn't a difference in gender in terms of readership. Although with EC comics, there were fewer girls who would have claimed readership with them.
In terms of the types of the things they were saying when they wrote,
it was pretty much the same. So, pretty much the same.
Time for one more question.
Have you thought about this discourse in relation to some of the discourse on more modern types of technologies or readership, what your reflections were on that?
I like to think that we have a lot to learn when we talk about social networking sites or video games or whatever the current boogeyman is. I think certainly this fits in the type of response patterns that Ellen Wartella and similar researchers have found in terms of moral panic and young people. But I do think that I think that what makes this more interesting here is the ubiquity of comics readership. I mean, if you look in terms just of saturation, there were more kids reading comics in the 50s than there are playing video games today. In terms of percentage, than are sending text, you know, several thousand text messages a month today. There are more kids who were reading comics in the 1950s than there are kids logging in to Facebook or other social network sites today. So it was much more part of the landscape than any of these things that we might find objection with today. And so I think that there are lessons to be learned, or insights, rather. In terms of my specific thoughts, I think we tend to not give kids enough credit in terms of their ability to think critically about what they're consuming in terms of media choices. That would be my short answer.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.